Hi everyone, I'm joined today by Alexander Mercouris and Alastair Crooke, former British diplomat and our favorite expert on the Middle East. And I thought we could start by talking about Iran as, Trump was elected to some extent as a peace candidate, but now he appears to be taking the US on a path towards war with Iran. At least it doesn't seem that he wants a war, but he has set demands on Iran, which has to be met. Otherwise, he seems to paint himself in a corner in which there would be war. So I thought a good approach to this is, well, I guess to outline a bit what his demands are, to what extent Iran can actually meet this demand, and if they fail to meet them, does Trump have any room to maneuver to scale back? Is this simply a very aggressive opening position, a maximalist as he always does, or are we effectively seeing a path to war here? I thought, well, I guess we can start by outlining what the demands are, because they did have an agreement in the past, JCPOA, which Trump himself pulled out of during his first administration. So, well, what is it exactly that the United States demand from Iran to not attack it?
Well, it's very interesting if you go back to that period when he exited the JCPOA, in which at that time it was, to any extent you can say, was pretty much working. I mean, it wasn't entirely satisfactory. However, what his complaints were essentially twofold. Of course, the main complaint was, and he said, we continue on this path and they'll end up with a nuclear weapon. But his main complaints were about Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, etc. There were proxy forces, which in his subsequent document issued by Poloni at that time, was very clear. There were 12 demands, and they started off with a complete sort of, if you like, undressing of the whole nuclear weapons program from 2003 period. I mean, which wasn't a formal program at all. There were just odds and ends going on in different parts. And then he withdrew from that, and also the missiles. Those were the two big things that he introduced. And Pompeo then produced this 12-point plan, which was, the kitchen sink. Everything really was required into it. And this was very much at the prompting. So, just as people say, Trump hasn't changed a bit on tariffs over 40 years. You can say he hasn't changed an iota on his demands on the Iranians and his pursuit of the Iranians. And in the present, what he said in the present document were 7 demands. And he did these in something which is called a National Presidential Memorandum. And it is a binding directive, which is legally binding on government agencies to implement specific actions precisely. And these were: 1, that Iran should be denied a nuclear weapon, the standard thing. Denied also intercontinental missiles. Denied 2, other asymmetric and conventional weapon capabilities. And to this end, the memorandum directs maximum economic pressure be imposed, that the Treasury act to drive Iran's oil exports to zero, and that the US work to trigger JCPOA snapback of sanctions. And finally, that Iran's malign influence abroad, its proxies, be neutralized. This was just on the 4th of February, about just over a month ago. This is what he signed into sort of the presidential directive. And some of it is based on the Pompeo version, but that's what it was. I mean, they were really sort of very binding and maximalist terms. And it did look as if he was moving Iran down a path to where there is war as its only outcome. Then he sent a letter via the Emiratis to Iran. And I mean, I can't guarantee that this is accurate because I only get it secondhand. But I understand that it had about 5 points in it. First one was dismantling Iran's nuclear infrastructure, halting uranium enrichment, halting it, ceasing arms transfers to the Houthis, ending financial support for Hezbollah, and disbanding the popular mobilization forces in Iraq. As I say, this comes from, as you probably know, the letter was delivered by the Emiratis, and the answer came back from Oman in that way, which I think was signaling. So the question is, what do we ultimately comes to judgment about Trump, I think, about where he's going and what he's doing. But there is a couple of signals that are quite important now. And these are not conclusive signals, but they, I think, are things that one should pay attention to. I've always believed in that idea of not the sort of mechanistic view of, if you like, international relations, looking at purely in a rational way. But when some things come out of the blue and they don't quite fit in the pattern, you look at them and you say, well, I mean, this is quite interesting. Well, one of them that came out of the blue is that the E3, that is the European states who are still members of the JCPOA, Germany, France, and the UK, have told Iran that they are going to trigger snapback by the end of June this year. And so I think this is an interesting, I mean, clearly concerted. The Europeans doing the work. The US cannot do it because it's no longer a member of the process. But the snapback system anyway expires in October. But for various reasons, there are processes within it where it takes a little time to take effect, because there's this reconciliation point where Iran can make their points, and then it goes into effect a little after that. So there isn't that much time. Maybe this is why he said it had to be done by spring. This was the deadline that everyone is talking. The other interesting thing, again, because I sort of pick out these things and think, these are interesting. They don't fit the sort of formal AI patterning of events, but they're interesting. That the US government has, and I get this from very good reporting in Lebanon, has warned the Lebanese government that they have banned any financial assistance to Lebanon until Hamas is disarmed, Hezbollah is disarmed, and secondly, in other words, Lebanon starts to move towards normalization with Israel. It's couched in terms of removes all the obstacles to the relationship with Israel. And there is a similar ban on any financial support, and this is more striking, any financial support except for various minor exceptions to Syria, with the same demands on them. And these were made fairly plain to Erdogan in terms of his relationship with Sharar. And Sharar has affected it, saying, we are ready to open relations with Israel. So what we're seeing a little bit, it seems to me, it is in fact that whole Witkoff vision that he outlined some times ago in his podcast with Tucker Carlson. And he said, look, think about it. He said, look, Lebanon, Hezbollah has been badly damaged in this period. And, it could normalize. It's possible. I think it's possible that they can normalize. And Syria, even, he said. You can listen to the podcast. He says, and Syrian. And he effectively then said, look, Sharar, is an SOB. Of course, I know it, but he's our SOB, he effectively said, because he's kicked the Iranians out. And then he talked about normalization. Well, it could then, if Gaza, we can manage that. Saudi Arabia will normalize it. And then that leaves the problem, which is Iran and its terrorist organizations. We call them that, terrorist organizations, the proxies of Iran. They must be made existentially neutralized towards, he didn't use exactly those words, but that was basically the gist of it, towards Israel. And then he added, imagine with that would be epic. It would be epic. It would be the normalization of the whole Middle East. He couched it in those terms, but I'm also putting it in today's terms and saying, look, when Trump seems to be hurrying this process along with Iran, what's happening with China? What's happening with Russia? Trump is wanting leverage, particularly on China, and particularly on Russia at this point, because he's threatening sanctions on Russia. But I mean, they're going to be meaningless. I think you've talked about this, Alexander, enough. I don't think, they're going to, they're certainly not going to change the course of, Russian policy. And so why do I say this? Well, of course, for China, it is very vulnerable on energy. And most of its energy, a lot of its energy comes from Iran. So not only would you get the Middle East neutralized and sort of normalized with Israel overall, but look, the energy there is our energy, ours. That's going to be ours, the gas, and we can control it, and we can control China, and we can make it difficult even for Russia by our control of the Middle East and the Middle East resources. Iraq, Iran, all of these resources. Now, you see a lot of people saying, but the oil price is going to go sky high and it's going to go up. We'd be paying $10 a gallon in the United States for our gasoline. But the message and the principles that they seem to be working on, and it's certainly the message that is being sent from Israel to the United States, is, look, this is how we do it. We don't mess up the, if you like, the energy paradigm at all. What we do is, the first wave, we go in, we take out all of Iranian air defenses. And the second wave, we go in and we take out the religious, the Ayatollahs, the IRGC leadership. This is why you see that very clear message in what I think it was Rubio said about, no, it was Waltz. Waltz in a statement about the attack on the Yemenis, on the Houthis. And he said, look, there's a different policy here. It's going to be different, our policy, from what it was under Biden. The different policy is essentially, one, we are going for decapitation. We are killing the leadership. And two, this is directed at Iran. And so if they take out that, the view, I'm not endorsing it. I have to underline, I don't share it. But the view is that Iran will be like Syria. It will just be like an open shop. Someone forgot to lock it up, and it will be all open. You just walk in and you take over, just as happened within a few days in Syria. And these people are talking, Of course, we'll have the Baluch rising up and the Azeris rising up, and everyone is going to be rising up, getting rid of the hated regime, and will substitute it with a pro-Western regime. And the Middle East will be solved. Great victory. Now, it's fantastical. But fantastical. But does Trump, really believe it? Like, for 40 years he's believed in this. And I'm saying really two things. And I don't know. This doesn't prove it. But I'm saying really two things about this. I mean, this would be a wonderful victory for him in this sense. He's surrounded by Israeli firsters and others who are all telling him Iran is on the ropes. It's it's staggeringly vulnerable. It lies naked. It hasn't got any air defenses. All of this nonsense. I mean, it's PR. I mean, so on the one hand, it's that. And then another thing that struck me was really interesting. It's in this piece that I'm sending you from the Substack, but in that piece, I can't give you the exact quote because it's quite earthy, from a White House insider. He says, you have to understand, look, Trump's in his last, this is probably his last term, okay? He just doesn't give an F for anything. He doesn't give an F because he's just going to do it. He will do what he said he would do before the election. And you bring bad news to him, like, say, China not playing ball, he doesn't give an F about this. And those are the sort of languages. He said, you've just got to understand, he just doesn't give a damn now. He'll do what he wants and what he said he'll do from the outset. Now, that may be, a personal miscalculation, but, there is a sort of sense of ruthlessness, of complete lack of sort of sensibility. I mean, when you look at things like Gaza, when you look at things like, really quite, ugly language used about the Houthis. I mean, we're doing the world a favor to kill them. Look, we had this great circle of Houthis celebrating Eid, and we dropped a bomb. Oops, there they go, and they're gone. They won't be attacking any American ships for the future. So I can't tell you that is the critical question. But all I would do is ask you one question about this in that sort of framework. What Iran seems to be proposing, and I'm not saying that this is actually their position, but it would make a lot of sense, is that they're going to say that they are going to reduce the level of enrichment, currently at 60%, reduce it down. They need 20% for the research reactor in Tehran, but they don't need more than that. Reduce the level, maybe ship some of the 60% to Russia or whatever you like, and then say, this is a goodwill gesture. Now lift some sanctions, and now let's talk about how we can take that forward. My question is, that's actually just the deal that Trump left, 8 years ago. It's no different. That's exactly what it was then. The extra enrichment came not because Tehran was moving towards a bomb, because the Europeans resiled on their undertakings. I'm sure you remember this, Alexander. They were supposed to be able to do business and to trade. That was, in the JCPOA. And the trouble was the banks wouldn't touch them in Europe. There was a word went round, you don't do business with Iran. It wasn't in any agreement, but I remember going around the city of London at that time, and everyone said, look, the U.S. Treasury people have been all around all around the banks, and they said, don't you start trading with Iran. And so because of that, Iran started putting extra leverage by increasing the level of enrichment. Finished. Sorry.
No, not at all. I have to say, listening to all of this, not only is it fantastical and extraordinarily dangerous, but dare I say it, not only do I not feel that it is new, I would say I have a sense of deja vu. It's 2002 all over again. It's exactly the same thing about Iraq. Get rid of Saddam Hussein, change the system there. All the problems in the Middle East are going to be solved. Go back to overthrowing the axis of evil. March on Tehran after you finish with Baghdad. And somehow everything in the Middle East will come and be sorted out, and everything will be back to where it was, where we would want it to be. A peace and stability would reign. Of course, we wouldn't have to worry about the Palestinians anymore, because we don't really worry too much about them, and nobody else would either if all of these things were done. It seems exactly the same. It's the sort of near-con vision, if I could put it like that, of that period, only amplified by 10. I mean, it's just doing the same thing all over again, but on a far more grandiose scale than we saw then. Now, of course,
and amplified, if I may just jut in for a second, amplified by the fact that throughout this, it has been run by Israel, by Netanyahu largely. This has been his project. He's managed it. He's still managing it, even though in a recent comment about someone saying, well, Israel is going to take the lead on this. And he said, he may think he's taking the lead, but I'm actually leading. That was Trump's comment to it. And I think, it puts this particular exercise in its own silo. It's sort of the repercussions affect China and Russia, yes, but it is in its own silo, because the support amongst both the AIPAC and the evangelicals for a removal of the threat from Iran is a different order from more or less any other issue that we're facing. So that actually is the sort of what I see it as a sort of the amplifier. I mean, more than even Iraq. I mean, even though that was being pushed by Netanyahu too.
But of course, the inconsistency, and there is a glaring one, is that Trump himself says Iraq was a mistake. He was elected to end the forever wars. He is going to commit the United States to the greatest war in the Middle East that it has ever fought, and one which it is going to lose, because the forces that he is conjuring here are on a scale that he simply doesn't seem to understand. And if I could say, that is a feature, a dangerous feature of Trump and of his administration. He consistently overestimates his ability and America's ability to bend people to his and its will. He thinks he can do that with China by imposing these enormous tariffs, and he seems surprised that the Chinese aren't calling him and asking to do a deal with him. He's complaining about that, apparently, to everybody that he can. He's surprised that the Russians haven't rushed to embrace his idea of a ceasefire in Ukraine, and I don't seem to be intimidated by the sanctions. And these threats he is making against Iran are not going to be accepted by Iran, and they're not going to be accepted by many other people. And taking this approach to Iran, I would have thought, is going to solidify support for Iran, probably in the region, but globally as well. I mean, when they see and understand that this is indeed the agenda, the Chinese, the Russians, everyone else are going to say to themselves, we have to make sure that Iran can withstand this blow, because if it doesn't, then they'll be coming for us. I mean, it seems to me, as I said, this is fantasy that only someone who simply doesn't understand or have grasp of the realities can ever lend themselves to. And I'm afraid Trump does sometimes come across to me as that sort of person. I mean, to
I
say
think
that it will end his presidency, that's almost the least of it, actually. It will end the United States as a great power.
No, I think what we're seeing clearly in the markets at the moment is a big shift of investments and money out of the United States. For the first time, people are not regarding the 10-year Treasury as a safe investment. I mean, this is what the basis trade. That actually it was nothing to do with China putting the things on. That was the cherry on the cake. Why he changed his tack was the blowing up of the basis trade, which is a highly complex sort of system of of the hedge funds, really arbitraging tiny changes between, if you like, the interest rates on 10-year treasuries and on future 10-year treasuries, and borrowing money to do that and borrowing money to buy the treasuries to do both, so that if there's any shift in the balance between the two, it can take the whole system down. And the basis trade is well over $1 trillion. I mean, it is huge. These hedge funds are just borrowing this, putting it in, making maybe 0.25%. But if you're dealing in $500 million, 0.25% is a lot of money. So they've been doing this. This is what brought down, the prime minister in Britain. In effect, it was pension funds being over leveraged that brought down Liz Truss in as much as anything. But I think that we are seeing something of a paradigm shift, an economic paradigm shift, which is what I was trying to sort of look at and address, because there's so much noise going on. But it does look as if we're seeing the decentering of the dollar. It's not over, of course, decentering of the dollar and the move. And this is a fantastic opportunity. I mean, which is what Putin expressed when he said, look, we've moved to the new paradigm. We're going back, if you like, we're going to the closed economy paradigm that was set out by List and Witte in the 19th century. And this gives us protection against sanctions. We become resistant to these things. But it also does something more, because it can be a move away from the neoliberalism sort of selfish gene type, the Ayn Rand type of selfishness is great, and so List deliberately attacked the Anglo model, Adam Smith, in this way, who said that, the utilitarian advantage of one individual in the whole is a utilitarian advantage of the whole country, of the whole state. It's just nonsense. Just because 10 billionaires in these last 2 days have made 135 billion on the volatility in the markets and in the bond market, the stock market and the bond market, in the volatility between these people made 130. How does that help your community, your country? And in the 19th century, they made this point, and Carl Polanyi said this. And I think this is a real opportunity to go back. He said, in the past, always throughout history, there was economic activity, organic economics, but it was within and subordinated to a polity, to the society, to the community as a whole. And neoliberalism came and turned all of that on its head and it has made, if you like, the markets the dominant, and we are subordinate to markets. Human beings are just subordinated. So there's no morality left, because all of the parts, if you like, that you get from mythology and the narratives of your society, the moral narratives of a civilization, just become tossed aside when it is the markets dictate. And we've heard this all this week. Markets dictated that Trump could do this. Markets, the bond market gave him a slap in the face. There's no issue about, ordinary humans in this. And so I think it is a real opportunity if it's seized. And I think Russia is already there, and China has also been there. This was the subject of a conversation between Xi and Putin many years ago about what happened. Why did the Soviet Union collapse, which he put down eventually to sort of nihilism of the Russian Communist Party. Very interesting conversation, but I think. Sorry, we've gone off your track a little bit down a sort of a rabbit hole. But I mean, I think we are seeing, and we do will my point I was saying is, for some time, I'll get to the real point. For some time, I've known both China, I'm sure you know, China and Russia have been planning, the end to the dollar hegemony in the world. The exorbitant privilege, as Putin calls it. They've been planning that, but have been reluctant to do that because they didn't want to, if you like, take down the world economic structures. Well, now America's taking it down. And this really gives an opportunity for China to move ahead, and to Russia, with the new trading and clearing and financial systems, which are sort of more based on financial tech, on digitalization. China has been quietly rolling out enormous amount of structures for the digital RMB. It's now actually operating in ASEAN and I believe in parts of the Middle East, using the M-bridge structures of clearing funds not through Western banks, but digitally central bank to central bank. So now I would say, I'm not saying I know that that's going to happen, even that I've been told, but it just seems so obvious, with what's going on. This is the moment really to take, BRICS pay, BRICS card, BRICS clearing forward. If they want to do it, these are the sort of conditions in which to do it, where no one will point their finger and say, you see, it's the BRICS that messed up the financial system. No, because they can see quite clearly that it isn't, that the dollar is sort of falling because of the financial crisis that's inherent in the system. What do you think, Alex?
Well, I don't think you should apologize for talking in an epochal way when the Americans are thinking of this, or saying that they are thinking in this epochal way. That's the first thing to say. And I absolutely agree. And I was reading this morning, there's a piece in TASS that the Russians are saying that the BRICS systems, the payment systems, are going to be opened to people who are outside BRICS. In other words, they want to expand it, which fits exactly into the point that you've just made, that they are indeed seizing the chance and that they're looking at this. Incidentally, I should also say that I've also had someone who has contacts in Russia, particularly in the Duma, and he says that the talk there is that all of these movements that we're seeing, the tariffs, the whole way in which this is being done, also has the Russians see this as having very much a look about it of preparations for actual war. I mean, kinetic, actual, real war. And that apparently there's a lot of discussion in Moscow as to whether this is, in fact, exactly where we are heading. And it looks as if, judging from the earlier things that you were saying, that is exactly what it is. War against Iran, clearly, war against possibly China too, because that seems to be increasingly the drift also. Again, the people who are doing these things in the United States don't understand properly what they're doing. They don't see this through, and they are misjudging the strength and the willpower of their adversaries. Anyway, Glenn, I'm sorry.
Just Glenn, because I want to hear what your reaction is too, because you are an economist in this. But I saw reports coming out from Washington just now that, as you know, Witkoff is in Moscow now. Today, he landed there today. And he carries a message. Maybe this is totally untrue. I'm a bit suspicious of its origin because it comes from Axios, but it comes from Axios, which says he carries a message to Trump. He isn't going to be there very long because he's supposed to be in Amman on Saturday. A message from Trump to Putin: do the ceasefire now. You've got a matter of weeks to do it, or else we're going to come down on you heavily with sanctions. Well, that's not going to go down well, as Alexander has just indicated, in Moscow. What's your thoughts, Glenn?
Well, first, just a quick comment on the economic issues, because I think that both the Chinese and the Russians, you mentioned Karl Polanyi, his main concern was that society becomes an appendage to the economy, so it just goes where the economy takes it, which is usually when social responsibilities are thrown away. But the main problem for the Russians and Chinese is that as long as the economy was American-driven, their societies to some extent were very much influenced. Yeah, so. But otherwise, it's worth noting that these economic ideas, which the Russians are playing with now, a lot of it had a huge origin from the United States. Because if you go back to Alexander Hamilton's time, their main concern was that the British economic dominance, that this was a form of free trade imperialism, which would prevent the development of their societies and many other problems. So the whole foundation of this for Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay to develop this American system, where they would have greater industrial autonomy, their own financial system, that is with their own national bank, control their own transportation corridors. A lot of this, this spread around the world, even Japan. But for Friedrich List, as you mentioned, he was effectively copy pasting the American system, and wanted to bring it to Germany with the railroads, national bank,
sure.
and it's the same. But and then you had Sergei Witte from Russia, who then the finance minister, who then translated the List's idea into pamphlets and handed them out in Russia. And now and this was quite. This was a key importance for Russia. They always looked to Sergei Witte, when they also pivoted to Asia. A lot of the same ideas were applied with the transportation corridors, the industrial autonomy, the financial autonomy. So a lot of this was came back to Alexander Hamilton's liberating America from the British effectively. But after the Soviet experience. They flirted again with liberalism under Yeltsin, but now they really gone back into List. So if you want to understand a bit the direction both the Russians and the Chinese are going, it actually has a very strong American origin.
Yeah, only it is, that it goes back to that sort of period of the Republic, not the Empire, and Buchanan and all those ideas. So it's very interesting, this interplay going on. I mean, Trump, as we know, is a fully paid up member of the neoliberal economic system. And that really was only entrenched in the 80s, I think, when all the regulatory elements were just removed en masse, and of course after 2008. But anyway, I just think this is something that we're just chatting about it, but I'm sure that there are people in China and Russia who are seized of this because, and Putin gave that speech on the 18th of March, and he said, the old order is over. We're still going to have sanctions, and we're going to have competition and rivalry, and all of this will be designed to oppress Russia and to put pressures on us. Isn't that exactly what you're saying Alexander was talking about with the British in a way? So, Russians being good historians probably will find, that this is thinking that this is the way they might talk to someone like Vance. I'm not sure if it would be, if Witkoff is open to it in that way. He's more of a sort of finance person, I guess, than thinking about, the community. Whereas Vance has always wondered, how do you, get the community back at the center of your politics? And because without that, you're stuck with this anomie, this, this sort of listlessness, this boredom, this sort of people just, ghost out of jobs, don't bother to turn up because it doesn't seem to them to be worthwhile. And that's in Europe and in America. How do you get, that sort of engagement back? Well, they've just given up on sort of, just being, if you like, the vassals of industrial and financial systems that, take screw every penny they can out of you. And they just decide it's not worth the candle because you never get anywhere anyway. The prevailing sentiment, I think, from so many in America and in Europe is the system, the economic system, is rigged against us. This is the moment, if they can do it, when Russia and China can start giving a lead to another view and actually bring back some sort of ethics into the economic. Incidentally, it's not just Germany and school. I remember reading some time ago Mohammed Bakr Sadat's book called Our Economy. He was in Iraq at that time. And that was very much the same. How do you provide the incentives for, enterprise, yet keep it within, if you like, an ethical framework at the same time? How do you manage that? And his book is really his answer to that. So it was in the East and, and in many places, and then got completely pushed out by that expression that Mrs. Thatcher loved. Tina, there is no alternative. There's no other system. We can't even think about it. Not that she'd ever read List or Witter, I'm sure, but, no, Tina, there's no alternative. We have to have, if you like, full freedom, end of regulations, must scrap all that, allow completely free range to financial institutions to do what they choose. And now America has suddenly found that this is biting them back badly. They've gone so far down that road, as precisely as List predicted, that actually now it's coming back to undermine them. And he said, at the end of the day, following that Adam Smith model would end up by destroying your system because you wouldn't be able to provide employment for people or consumption because you would have skewed the whole thing towards a financialized world and there wouldn't be any real economy left. And that's exactly what's happened to the United States. It seems to me in the spirit why we've got the dollar falling at the moment and the bond market punching Trump in the face, as those very sort of Wall Street people like to say.
Mm-hmm. Well, quite things. So, tell us a bit about the situation as you can see it in Iran, because going back to the original part of our program, I mean, Iran is clearly the linchpin, at least in the theory of the minds of the people who are going to follow this plan. I mean, I've never been to Iran, but my own sense is that there are many divisions there. This is a complex society, but I don't think it's going to fall apart under the kind of pressure that people in the West assume. I think that we don't understand the political system very well. It looks very disorganized and chaotic, but it does seem to have a kind of inner coherence about it. What would happen if there was an American attack on Iran? Would they go nuclear, for example?
No, I don't think they would go nuclear.
Yeah.
I don't actually think they have a nuclear weapon at this point. They could do it. I mean, they have the technical capacity. But, all during the Iran-Iraq war, when Iraq was using chemical weapons and injuring people in their chemical weapons attack, Iran refused to go down the route of copying this and reciprocating. So I don't think they would go down nuclear. I'm fairly sure they would not do that. I think that, yes, what we're seeing is really, it is divided, but not as divided as people think. There is quite a sort of vocal and quite a prominent faction, which is really the Zarif faction, which is the reformists, who are fully in favor of sort of cooperating and having relations with the United States. The foreign minister who's going to lead this, who was a nuclear negotiator, I can't remember when, but about 10 years ago, he's very competent, and etc. But he's always been, pro a discussion with the United States and a negotiation that would bring an agreement and the end of sanctions on Iran. And then there is quite a forceful section, including most of the IRGC, who have a big constituency with them and with the militias around it. I don't mean a forced one. I don't want to make it sound artificial, but it is it is one that makes a very valid point, and they say, all the time you have to match, if you like, willingness to negotiate, but that has to be balanced by integrity and by the willingness to, be firm on things. You can't just simply say, oh, well, we're ready to negotiate and tell, say to America, yes, I'm so-and-so and I'm happy to negotiate with you, because that smells of weakness to the United States. And you won't get a good agreement that way. Then, on the other hand, and I think the person who advocated this was Abdullahian, the foreign minister who was killed in that helicopter crash. And he was always, I remember listening to him at great length saying, the question is, there's no good just advertising you're ready to do an agreement, because that won't work with America. It's not ever worked. So how do we do this? How do we express, our defensive capacity, our military capacity, in such a way that they hear and they listen and they understand that if we're pushed to it, yes, we can use this, and it will be devastating for you, America, and for Israel as the consequences. And so what's been playing out has been that sort of balance, plus another one, I think, which is been playing out in the sense that I think the supreme leader and really the political elites as a whole see quite clearly, rather as others do, that the future is in the East, in the Central Asia, and that Iran is going to play a key role. It sits on the north-south corridor, east-west corridor. It is the pivot of the whole economic structure of Central Asia, and that's where it should be focused. But there is an element of Iran. Just in Lebanon, you have this part of Lebanon which is called Ashrafia, which is peopled by people who still speak French there rather than Arabic, although they know Arabic, and sort of pretend that somehow the helicopter dropped these people by mistake in Lebanon instead of in a suburb of Paris, as they should have been. And there is a little bit of something similar in North Tehran, that these people look to the West. You could compare it, if you like, to the sort of Peter the Great aspect in Russia, although that's now sort of past. But just to say that that's much smaller than it used to be, much, much smaller. And Zarif doesn't have power that he did during that period when the negotiations were taking place and he was talking to Kerry all the time, chatting to him sort of daily. That's no longer, very far removed from that. So I suspect that what we're going to see is that what the supreme leader is trying to do and the political elite, they don't want to just shut down the reformists, but they want to bring them in the tent. They don't want them put outside the big Iranian tent and to sort of aggravate from outside inside. Mm-hmm. There's more colorful expressions about that. But it's they want them in because they also want them to begin to start understanding that Iran has to look east and look to its relationship with Russia, which is difficult for many Iranians, but to look at that and China, where they do have a very close relationship with China, and away from the Europeans and the Americans. So I think they don't want to just sort of bash them down and push them out or anything. They want to bring them in. And so we'll see. Arachi will make his case if I don't know whether it'll be direct or indirect. But I mean, the message, I think, will be some sort of form. I haven't got any of the details of it, but I suspect that's largely right. Yes, we can do some things, but we can't solve all of this in 2 months. So we need more time, but we'll do this, and we will expect relief of sanctions as a confidence-building exercise from the United States. And I don't think that will be accepted by Trump, and I know it won't be accepted by Netanyahu or the Israelis, or by most of the advisors around Trump, because I think there's so many of them who are hardline Israeli firsters. I mean, really tough. I mean, really, lacking all sort of empathy beyond that for Israel.
I guess my final question is, more of a concluding remark. How do you then conclude more or less that there will be an effort to reach an agreement, it will fail, and there will be war? And if so, when would this come? Do you think before the summer?
Well, all I can say is I think we are on a path to conflict, because I just think it's so unlikely that the present configuration in Israel or the United States, with the overwhelming support that AIPAC enjoys within Congress and elsewhere, can tolerate the idea just simply going back to the failed formula of the past and saying, well, that's fine, because from the point of view of Israelis, it was a failure. Most Israelis and most of the Americans that surround Trump regard it as a failure, and it needs to be readdressed. So I think that principally we're on a path to war. However, what I would say is that I don't want to give it odds. I refuse to give it odds, because I think we are in such a period of volatility and turmoil that it's events that are leading politics, not political ideologies and blueprint that are determining our future now. I mean, events are going to do it. What happens in America, what happens financially and economic, they do determine the politics, and the politics is determined by, the financial system that, the victors after the Second World War put in place. I mean, this is what we're living through, and it's now come to a crisis. I think that ultimately, probably, this long struggle in which Israel has wanted to impose a sort of, if you like, a greater Israel hegemony across the entire region, is going to end in a trial of strength of one sort. I can't see, in this way, Alexander comes from a family of diplomats and area. I am of a slightly different background, whereas I think that occasionally you can't move politics. Politics becomes fossilized and stuck. And you have to have, the two parties have to go head to head. And out of that, then it's possible to move politically in the wake of that. But I wouldn't be surprised if we have to go. Israelis, incidentally, are saying that blatantly in the Hebrew side. They say, look, negotiations, we're all in favor of negotiations, but we have to have the war first. That's their sort of expression of it. So events, dear boy, are going to, I think, in this next period, have a commanding effect, both in Iran and what happens with the relationship between Russia and America.
I have to say I agree, and I should say very quickly that absolutely diplomacy absolutely does have its limits. History, world history confirms that. I mean, you can only diplomacy can only work if there is a mutual will for it to work. If it's not there, then you're going to have conflict, and sometimes conflict is unavoidable. And then the job of the diplomats is, when it's over, is to put it all, or pick up the pieces and try to put something together again.
Exactly.
And then not just the diplomats, by the way. The diplomats play a role, but so do many others, the economists, the technologists, all of those sort of people too. Well, Alastair, I have no further questions. I've given much food for thought from what you have to say. Just to say thanks again. I don't know whether Glenn has anything further. Perhaps, Alastair, you have something more.
No, just thank you for your insights. I thought this very interesting.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
Our pleasure.